Okay, now let's move on to the special lecture by Professor Benoit Collins. He's a former JSPS postdoc fellow and currently serves as a professor at the Department of Mathematics at Kyoto University. He is also a recipient of the 19th JSPS Prize, as President Sugino mentioned. The title of his lecture is Academic Bridges, a Foreigner's Perspective on Research and Life in Japan. Please welcome Professor Collins.
So can you hear me? Yes. Okay, so welcome everybody, and thank you very much for the introduction. So today I will not speak about mathematics, and actually I'm not used to speaking about something else than mathematics, so it will be a new experience for me as well. So my name is Benoit Collins, and I'm a professor at Kyoto University's Mathematics Department, and I would like to share my experiences as a foreign researcher in Japan, reflecting on 2 decades of both academic and cultural integration in Japan. So in this talk, I will explore the cultural and professional transitions involved in returning to Japan as a foreign academic, the unique opportunities for collaboration within Japanese academia, and the systemic challenges that persist. And I hope that the reflections based on my experience will provide insight into building an international academic career in Japan. So first, I should say a couple of words about myself, I suppose. I was born in France and lived there until I completed my PhD in mathematics in Paris in 2003. Then I in 2013, I took a permanent position at Kyoto University's Mathematics Department, and I have been in Kyoto ever since. But after my PhD between 2003 and 2005, I was a JSPS postdoctoral fellow at Kyoto University. And after I completed my postdoctoral fellowship in Japan, I worked for a while as a tenured researcher in France at CNRS, and then as a professor at the University of Ottawa in Canada. So I've been working as a regular academic staff on 3 continents, Europe, North America, and Japan, Asia now. So I would like first to talk about my motivation to come to Japan, and perhaps start with it's an anecdote. So I have 3 kids, and last fall, I spent a couple of months in France for a long-term academic stay. And on that occasion, my kids went to middle school in France. So I should add that they are primarily of Japanese culture. My wife is Japanese. And I was very surprised to see the huge amount of interest that Japan and Japanese culture still triggers among kids in France. I didn't expect that. I was very happy to see this soft power of Japan. And from my kids saying, it seemed that kids were very interested in manga and so on. So when I was a teenager and a student in the 1990s, young people in France were also interested in Japan, but for different reasons. For example, maybe martial arts or literature also. And as far as I'm concerned, I was fascinated by the cultural differences between Japan and Europe, the history, but also, it was in the 90s, the economic power of Japan, which was at its peak at that time. And importantly, for me, as a mathematician, to be the talent of Japanese mathematicians. So I studied in France at École Normale Supérieure de Paris, and our professor in charge told us that in addition to studying mathematics very hard, we had better do sports and other intellectual activities to keep balance and to remain sane. And one possibility that was offered to us was to study exotic, from our point of view, exotic foreign languages, and Japanese was one of the options. So I happen personally to like foreign languages as a communication means. And it turns out there was an exchange program between ENS Paris and the University of Tokyo. So I chose Japanese language primarily in the hope to take advantage of this exchange. And later, but only later, a few years later, my motivation changed because I married a Japanese person, and this, of course, influenced my subsequent career choices. Okay, so this slide talks about my first stay in Japan, which was in 1999 as a 6-month Mombusho exchange student, the program which I mentioned before, which had some partnership between the University of Tokyo and my university, ENS, and it had been only used so far by students in humanities. I was the first science student to want to use it. Again, it was the 90s, so quite a while ago. And now, as a professor in Kyoto, I welcome interns from all over the world, including France, pretty much every year. So during my 6 months in the University of Tokyo, I was warmly welcomed by 2 professors. My initial area of specialization was probability theory. So there was a professor in probability theory. And this stay in Japan allowed me to transition mathematically from probability to operator algebras. So during these 6 months, which I spent as an exchange student, I was doing intensive mathematics, but also intensive language learning, and also intensive networking. So networking was quite easy because there were very few foreigners, actually. Maybe it's a bit paradoxical. And people in Japan were very happy to communicate with me. So there were 2 sides here. On the personal side, I, as a hobby in France, I was doing semi-professional sailing. And so in the University of Tokyo, I joined a sailing circle, and made lots of friends and got a chance to observe the social student life in Japan. And on the work side, I also participated to many research seminars, and in particular, I enjoyed a lot the drinking parties afterwards. So I had lots of lunches and dinners with my Japanese and also a few foreign office mates. And all these exchanges were extremely enjoyable. And I met lots of lasting friends, many people who are still friends and colleagues in Japan. So during this, my 6 months as an exchange student, with all this hard work on language learning and all these opportunities to network, I became fluent in oral Japanese. So maybe in the European benchmark, maybe something like B1 or so, which means I was able to have some oral conversation about most basic topics and enjoy dinner in Japanese with Japanese colleagues. And I could, of course, not read and write Japanese properly. And here also a small personal anecdote, which is that a classmate of mine back in France, who had done during the very same time an internship in Italy, came back in the same time as me, and he came back speaking almost perfect Italian, and with little effort somehow. And it made me realize somehow how different Japanese is from Western languages, at least in my perspective. So now fast forward to 2003, when I took my JSPS postdoctoral fellowship, and I could already, I had also improved a bit my Japanese at that time, because I had also married with a person of Japanese origin. And my Japanese host in Kyoto University, again in 2003, gave me the mysterious advice not to spend too much time on learning to read and write Japanese, but rather focus on mathematics. And it took me some time to understand this advice, and I should say initially I had a strange feeling about it, why discourage somebody to invest time in the language of your country? But in the end, I think it was, at that time, a valuable advice, and I'll try to comment a bit more on that later. And another important thing about these early times of mine in Japan was that as a foreigner, and therefore as a minority, perhaps even more back then than now, I was taken care of very well by some very senior, extremely renowned Japanese professors in my area. And I only realized later that I had been very fortunate to be in contact with such world-class researchers at such an early stage of my career. And I think actually it played a big role in my development as a scientist. So then, in 2013, I returned to Kyoto permanently. And as I said a bit earlier, I had previously spent a few years in France as a tenured researcher, and then in Canada as a tenure track and then tenured associate professor. And actually, my three children were actually born in Canada. My professional and personal life in Canada was very rewarding. And as a European, I learned many North American codes which I didn't have, and the North American dynamic way of doing research. I was given in Canada the opportunity to take important responsibilities and I also made many close friends and colleagues in Canada, which again are still friends and colleagues. So why choose to come back to Japan? Actually, so Kyoto University headhunted me at the time where they were looking for foreigners, and I accepted to come because I like a lot the city of Kyoto. I had kept from my postdoctoral time a good network of friends and colleagues. And I also, of course, had a very deep respect for many researchers in Kyoto University with whom I'm still interacting a lot. And I had high expectations on the possibility to train graduate students and to have research activities in Kyoto. I have also to add that my wife was very happy to come back to Japan, even though I should mention that she's not from Kyoto actually. So it was just about Japan. And something else also, which is not scientific but which still matters, another reason that brought me back to Japan is the quality of life for the non-work related part. Like there is a very good healthcare, very good food, very nice sceneries, it's a very safe place and all that. So this state of things has not changed substantially in 10, 20 years in my opinion. And here I will take also, since I have to be honest about everything, I take this chance to make a short comment on academic salaries in Japan. So 20 years ago, the salary of a JSPS postdoctoral fellow was actually very competitive in the world benchmark. In 2013, it was still competitive. Sadly, I think it's not so much competitive anymore, even though I say to young people who want to come that it still allows to live very, very decently in Japan. So that's some kind of a global issue, and that's probably not the place to discuss it, but it's a fact to be known. So in my experience, actually, there is a dichotomy among foreign senior researchers in Japan. There are those who are very well integrated in the Japanese system and who often started their life very early in Japan, for example, as graduate students or sometimes as postdocs, and who just then stayed all the time in Japan subsequently, didn't travel a lot outside of Japan and their home country. And another category of people, probably fewer, who come to Japan only at a later point, and maybe they are more global, but they tend to master less well the Japanese codes. And well, I think I was somehow falling between the cracks in between these two categories. So I I got also the feeling that this dichotomy has an economic side effect, that foreigners who are well inserted in the Japanese world and culture paradoxically struggle a bit more to get permanent position in Japan, perhaps because of the law of supply and demand, because since they want to be in Japan and since Japan has good soft money to offer them non-permanent positions, even though, in my opinion, sometimes this equilibrium can affect the attractivity of Japanese academia. So personally, actually, I made it clear when it was to come back in 2013 that I would not leave a permanent position abroad to come back to Japan, and it was actually not completely obvious to some of my Japanese colleagues with whom I was having some negotiations, and I realized that this is an important but not so well documented cultural difference between Japan and other places in which I have lived. So. Each university in Japan is unique, but as far as I can tell, most universities tend to obey similar global rules, and these rules tend to be very different from other countries in which I have lived. Some rules can be strange and disorienting, and maybe some of them are unspoken, and when I arrived, some of them didn't make sense to me, and I found some of them to be counterproductive. So I will just give one example. If you travel somewhere for business with reimbursement, in many cases, it's very difficult to extend your travel for reasons not related to the business trip, even at your own expenses. And a concrete example is, it's very difficult for me as a professor in Kyoto University to invite some world superstars to visit Japan, because when they come, they say, I want to do some sightseeing, and then it becomes very difficult for me to pay their return flight with Kakenhi or Kohi or something else. So this rule, as far as I can tell, does not exist in other countries in which I have worked. So this is a difference. Interestingly, I figured out that many of my Japanese colleagues, too, didn't know why such rules exist. They had just never questioned it because they were used to it since they were very young, and they thought this is the same all around the world. So I think here it's important to understand that in my experience, many Japanese scholars have actually spent time abroad and can communicate very well internationally for scientific purposes, but they have almost never done administration or teaching abroad. And as a matter of fact, I think that it is forbidden by some Japanese postdoctoral fellowship rules. So, as an associate professor in 2013 in Kyoto, I was an observer of rules in my university, in my Japanese university. I had to learn them and comply with them. I had no power on them. And sometimes knowing that there exist some other rules was a bit frustrating. But I just focused on trying to understand why such rules have been established. And quite often I found answers, or at least partial answers. And then in 2020, I became a full professor. And here I think it was a very tough choice for my colleagues in Kyoto to decide whether to promote me, because a full professor in Japan has heavy administrative duties, and it was not clear how much of a burden I would be to them, how efficient I would be as a foreigner for administrative tasks. And indeed, I had to learn many unspoken rules. So in Japan, being a full professor requires hearing the true opinion, sometimes called honne, of colleagues, including harsh ones. And some Japanese people, I think, were not comfortable with that because they were not used to speaking true language with foreigners. However, I have to say that this basically did not happen to me in my department because everybody treated me very respectfully as a peer, despite the fact that I was actually sometimes slowing down people from time to time because of my insufficient language skills or understanding of tradition, including unspoken ones. So I would like to discuss also the importance of Japanese language to do academia in Japan. And there are some places in Japan, but very few, like perhaps OIST at Okinawa, where you can really do everything in English. But it's actually a pitfall to imagine that you can get away on the long run in Japan without some command of Japanese language. One has to face the fact that Japanese is a language that is very remote from most widely used languages in academia, although I should say that Korean and Chinese perhaps might be a bit different, and people from these countries tend to learn Japanese a bit faster than Westerners. And so the question is, what should you do as a foreigner in Japan? And my advice to my visitors and my students is as follows: that everybody should learn the basic greetings at least, and if possible the alphabets and a few kanji, because for one, people in Japan will really appreciate the effort. And then if you want, you could study more if you like studying languages, but you don't have to. And something which is important here is that in general, you should not expect that you will become fluent soon. So you should, but you should not consider this as a valid reason to ignore Japanese language. Actually, here a small anecdote is that a great shock was when my kids told me a couple of years ago, French is so hard, way harder than Japanese. And I thought it's impossible, but actually I think that they were right from their point of view of Japanese learners. So when you actually learn enough of Japanese, you will realize that it's a very different language, and then it will become impossible to concur with all the average foreign naysayers who say recklessly Japanese are bad at English. I think that the truth is just that Japanese and English are very different languages, and we tend to expect that if we speak English, we can go anywhere in the world. And although this is true to some extent from a logistical point of view, I think it's a very Western-centric point of view. And learning Japanese will certainly help you to gain respect for your Japanese peers who have mastered English to such a level. And it will also help you sometimes understand what they really mean, as there are some expressions in English that are typical to Japanese. It's not just about probably it applies to every country, but it definitely applies to Japanese language as well. So, so yes, something else which I would like to point out is that beyond the language goes beyond the pure academic language studies such as JLPT or TOEFL or all that. So there are people I know some foreign people in Japan who can speak very well Japanese, but who cannot, as one says in Japanese, read the air. So in Japanese it's kuki or yomu. So which means they don't really understand what people, how people think. And conversely, there are some people who cannot speak so well Japanese, but they understand very well how Japanese people think. And in my opinion, the biggest impact of language study, apart from communication, is to improve your understanding of how people think. And I think this aspect of language study is really underrated. So many times I have encountered problems in Japan related to human relations, and I was surrounded by mentors, friends, family, whom I trusted, and I would ask them, how do I solve this problem which I encountered? And I could not have solved such a problem by myself with just my knowledge, but my colleagues would tell me, my Japanese colleagues would tell me, in this case, Japanese people expect you to do that. And this answer was obvious to Japanese people, but not to foreigners. So this answer was written nowhere. And personally, I was extremely lucky to be surrounded by such reliable, what I call cultural translators, who helped me really to thrive in Japan. And now I'm actually trying to do the same at my scale with younger people who come and visit my lab from abroad. Next, I would like to speak about my experience during the last 5 years as a full professor. So during my first years in Kyoto, I was an associate professor. I had witnessed many practices which did not align with my opinions. But associate professors do not really have, at least in my university, room for critique, at least officially. But when you become a full professor in Japan, you make all the decisions. So Japan has a culture of collegiality, so everybody should match their opinion. And when I was first asked to give my opinion, I felt that I have a lot to say, but I should also make some priorities and choose my battles, so to say, in order not to be seen as a pest. So I made actually some propositions of improvements which mattered most to me. And sometimes it was a source of frustration because they were not immediately followed by change. I realized that people tend to be very prudent, actually, and they want to understand deeply the pros and the cons before making a decision. So even though I am sometimes impatient, now I start to appreciate people's prudence in the environment in which I work, and of course I have managed to make some changes which I deem improvements. So down these nice aspects as well. And another topic here, which I realized to be important to me, is the status of minorities in Japan. So in my area, which is mathematics, there are very few foreigners in Japan, and also very few women. And I actually realized that these problems are treated separately, although, in my opinion, they are very related. Actually, a female colleague of mine in Japan pointed out that the approach to improving the balance in the two cases should be the same, and this should be a revelation. This is also why I want to speak about it here. And in a related vein, at earlier stages of my career, sometimes I was explicitly reminded in Kyoto that I had been hired in a prestigious university because I was a foreigner, which is some microaggression in the sense that there was no bad intent for this. Maybe this was true to some extent, but there was no point in saying that. So this happened in the past, but it has not happened in the last few years, so which is an interesting improvement. And another important observation is that when I was abroad, I was actually not a minority because I was a white male in a Western country. But now I am a minority, foreigner in Japan, so I understand both points of views, and I realize that the majority of majorities would easily realize the feelings of minorities if properly explained. So this is why, having seen both sides, I try to work on this now. Maybe I will accelerate a little bit on that because I'm a little bit behind schedule, and I will actually. So there is this catch-all colloquium of Japan here, which is an initiative which I created a couple of years ago, which I would like to explain. So 4 years ago, with a handful of colleagues, we created this cultural colloquium. So this is also the website in the background. And our observation was that foreign scholars, Japanese scholars, but also young researchers, experienced researchers, men and women, were not discussing enough together. And there existed, of course, discussion panels aside of conferences of scientific societies, for example, but they were not directly linked to scientific talks, and thus offered an excuse for people not to attend them. And the concept of our colloquium was to have a two-part event where one single speaker would first give a high-level scientific talk, followed by a societal talk of her or his choice. And so it was supposed to highlight the fact that everybody has two facets, a human personality and a scientific personality. We made it online due to COVID, but it also allowed many people to participate. And it has it's become a major mathematical event in Japan right now. So, and I see that it helped many people to navigate from abroad, but from other minorities to navigate the academic world in Japan. And I'm almost done. Just 2 more slides. So I think I'm supposed to give. I believe that I should give some advice. I would like to do so about languages. I think that Westerners, including myself, had a point when 20 years ago they said something like learning Japanese to a fluent level is way too demanding, especially on the written side. And the thing is that back then, the only way to learn Japanese was to memorize a lot with matter which is not adapted to maybe your age or your background. And if you didn't know kanji, you had to bother people, how do you read this? Or make some tedious search in a dictionary or that. But the point is that technology has changed all that. And now if you don't understand something in Japan, you just use Google Translate, scan the character, use DeepL, ChatGPT. Even if you write an email, you can ask ChatGPT to improve. So there are no excuse anymore not to work with Japanese. You can also learn with gamified apps and all that. And something important is that various media resources like blogs or YouTube channels offer deeper insight into the Japanese culture and enhance the overall learning and understanding experience. So I learned a lot about unspoken rules, which I mentioned before, through the social media. And there might not be a good manual about unspoken rules, but there is enough on YouTube or other media. And when I have visitors, actually, I give them a couple of channels and recommend them to watch them thoroughly. So, So to conclude this presentation, I will just tell you what I say to foreign students who want to do a PhD or a postdoc with me in Kyoto. I tell them that before deciding to come, they should understand that applying for a position here in Japan is not like applying for a position in any interchangeable English-speaking country, like you just click on one more application. There is, of course, no need to be a nerd of Japanese culture or manga, but still you should be prepared for some difference. And so success requires adaptability and respect for cultural nuances, but you should embrace challenges as learning experiences. And if you plan to stay on the long term and are given a chance to do so as I was given the chance, it's good to remember that you are a guest, or at least will be so for a very long time, unless becoming almost a local. And advocating for change is a gradual process that necessitates persistence. And finally, I tell people to leverage technology nowadays and also mentorship while approaching cultural differences with curiosity and respect. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Collins. He will remain with us for the rest of the day, so please feel free to engage in the conversation or ask questions during the following sessions. So, Professor Collins, would you please be back to the seat? Okay, let's have another round of applause.